All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the panel discussion on power dynamics and abuse in collegiate sports, improving institutional response and developing strategies to prevent a hostile environment within athletics and recreation programs in higher education. Before we begin, I would like to turn it over to the interpreter one more time just to tell you how to connect to interpretation services in case you need it. Thank you so much. So, my name is Latanisha Lewis. I am an associate director of the Campus and Restorative Practices Grant Programs Unit within the Office on Violence Against Women. OVW, in partnership with our wonderful colleagues from the Civil Rights Division, Educational Opportunities Section, we are excited to explore this unique topic with you today in recognition of National Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Within both OVW and the Civil Rights Division's work within the Department of Justice, we are committed to supporting survivors of sexual assault and raising the visibility of survivors' diverse experiences to the larger campus community. One area where more information can be shared about survivors' experience is around the power dynamics and abuse in collegiate sports. So before I tell you more about the goals of our discussion today and the panelists that have joined us to share their expertise on this topic, I'd like to review a few logistical matters. So as you heard our interpreter this morning, to ensure that all attendees are able to fully participate in the webinar, we have muted all lines so we are able to clearly hear the presenters without interruption. And in addition, we are providing Spanish interpretation. In the language you prefer, please review the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the interpretation or globe icon and choose the language you want to utilize for this webinar. We're also recording this webinar so that you may have the opportunity to share this important information with colleagues or for your own reference at a later date. To ask questions during the discussion portion of the webinar, utilize the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen, and we will ensure that the panelists are able to see the questions posed. During the panel discussion today, we will offer insight into the ways in which the unique relationship between student athletes and coaches/trainers may foster distressing power dynamics. We will identify indicators of potential abusive conduct within the athlete coach or athlete trainer relationship. We'll clarify educational institutions' obligation to properly respond to reports of a hostile environment within the athletic and recreation context, including recommendations for assessing for climate issues and implications of sex discrimination, and offer recommendations on how an educational institution may best respond to such conduct, including strategies they may employ to deter such conduct. Given the nature of this topic, we would like to acknowledge that the information shared during this webinar may impact those affected by trauma. So if you need to, please don't hesitate to step away as needed to take care of yourself. We also encourage those who would benefit from resources and supports to visit the National Sexual Assault Hotline at www.hotline.rainn.org or call 1-800-656-4673. Now, to frame our discussion today, we are excited to have the OVW Director, Rosie Hidalgo, with us today to provide opening remarks. Rosie Hidalgo joined the Office on Violence Against Women as its director in July 2023. After serving as special assistant to the president and senior advisor on gender-based violence at the White House Gender Policy Council. She previously worked at OVW as deputy director for policy in the Obama-Biden administration, during which time Rosie was detailed to the office of the vice president. working with the White House Advisor on Violence Against Women. Rosie has worked in the movement to end gender-based violence for over 30 years as a public interest attorney and as a national policy advocate. At the outset of her career, she provided direct civil legal services through nonprofit organizations in New York and Virginia. Prior to her work at the White House, she was the Senior Director of Public Policy for Casa de Esperanza, National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, now called Esperanza United, a national resource center with a focus on providing training, research, and policy advocacy to prevent and end domestic violence and sexual assault. Rosie has also served on the Biden Foundation's Advisory Council for Ending Violence Against Women and on the American Bar Association's Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. Without further ado, OVW Director Hidalgo.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lottie, for that kind introduction. Thanks also for your tremendous dedication and leadership and for planning this important webinar today. I also want to extend my gratitude to DOJ's Civil Rights Division and the Educational Opportunities section in particular for co-hosting this webinar with OVW. During the month of April each year, as Lottie mentioned, it's an opportunity for us to observe Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. And this April marks the 23rd annual observance of SAM, as it's called. We appreciate this opportunity to gather with all of you who are participating today in this important webinar focused on power dynamics and abuse in collegiate sports and improving institutional responses. And in particular, I would extend my gratitude to our panelists for your leadership and dedication and your participation in this dialogue. I am honored to serve as the Director of the Office on Violence Against Women here at DOJ, also known as OVW. Our office has the responsibility of overseeing implementation of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, landmark bipartisan legislation that was first enacted in 1994 and most recently was strengthened and expanded through the VAWA Reauthorization Act of 2022. So this year marks the 30th anniversary since the original enactment of VAWA. And while significant progress has been made, we also know that we have much further to go. OVW is committed to continuing to work with partners across the federal government and across the country with all of you to advance our nation's commitment to preventing and also to improving our response to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, and other forms of gender-based violence. So we're here today to focus on how we can best support student athletes to improve our prevention efforts and to also help create a college environment that is supportive of survivors of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking. We know that significant power dynamics, like the ones between college athletes and their coaches and trainers, can be a high risk factor for abuse. It is critical that we learn more about these potential forms of abuse, how to prevent it, how to respond effectively and swiftly to any such abuse. Students should be able to get education and participate in collegiate sports without experiencing sexual violence or the fear of being harmed. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, the Justice Department just last week announced that it had settled claims surrounding the horrific abuse against athletes perpetrated by Larry Nassar. I'd like to reiterate what Acting Associate Attorney General Ben Meiser said, quote, "For decades, Lawrence Nassar abused his position, betraying the trust of those under his care and medical supervision while skirting accountability. These allegations should have been taken seriously from the outset. While these settlements won't undo the harm that Nassar inflicted, our hope is that they will help give the victims of his crimes some of the critical support they need to continue healing," end quote. Taking these crimes seriously and approaching them in a way that is both trauma-informed and survivor-centered is exactly what underpins our work at the Office on Violence Against Women. And the hallmark of VAWA is what's known as a coordinated community response, or a CCR, a cross-disciplinary approach to addressing these critical issues. A survivor's experience with each person they encounter on their path to learning about their options, to seeking services, to reporting a crime or offense is critical as to how or if that survivor is able to access safety, justice, and healing. And so over the nearly 30 years since VAWA was enacted, we've been able to support a wide variety of programs through VAWA grants across the country, from training law enforcement to enhancing comprehensive services for victims, to supporting initiatives that engage youth and men in efforts to prevent gender-based violence. In fiscal year 2024, Congress allocated $713 million for VAWA programs, the highest amount ever. And since we're speaking today specifically about collegiate athletics, I would like to quickly highlight OVW's Campus Grant Program, which funds a coordinated community response at colleges and universities and provides services for survivors. The campus program supports efforts to hold offenders accountable, as well as promote strategies to prevent, investigate, and respond to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And grantees are required to focus on that coordinated approach across their campus that involves all those whom a survivor may encounter, including campus victim service providers, law enforcement and campus safety officers, campus administrators, Title IX officials, healthcare providers, also engaging student leaders and others. And leaders in the athletics department should also be a part of these coordinated community approaches. The campus program should also ensure that if a victim wants to access the criminal and/or civil justice systems, that they can be connected with local criminal justice agencies and also service providers off campus, including local law enforcement agencies, prosecutors' offices, courts, and other victim service organizations. And we've also expanded our initiatives through our Campus Grant Program to increase support for a diverse range of colleges and universities, whether they are large or small, urban or rural, and also including special initiatives for historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and other minority serving institutions. It's important to call everyone in and make sure that resources and support are available, as well as our national training and technical assistance that's available for all colleges and universities, regardless of whether or not they're grantees. There are key resources that can be beneficial. So it's imperative that institutions of higher education have clear, consistent, trauma-informed policies and procedures and clear guidance on how an offender will be held accountable. And as you may be aware, earlier this month, the U.S. Department of Education released the final Title IX regulations. And so these regulations provide essential protections against sex discrimination for all students and employees, including restoring and strengthening full protection from sexual violence and other sex-based harassment in federally funded educational institutions, and also ensuring protections against discrimination, including discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. For those who choose to report, the new regulations require a prompt, fair, and transparent response by the institution and require protection against retaliation for the person reporting. These new and strengthened Title IX regulations will go a long way in protecting students, including college athletes, and providing an excellent roadmap for institutions to create survivor-centered and trauma-informed policies that ensure fairness for all parties. So I am grateful to each of you. I know everyone is so busy. I'm so grateful that you have taken the time to join this webinar today. I'm grateful for your dedication and your commitment wherever you are and whatever your role is. Each of us has an important role to play in ending sexual violence against student athletes and against anyone in institutions of education. By coming together, we can learn from each other on how best to support survivors and prevent these harms. So we have great speakers and a great panel here today. Thank you so much to Emily Austin, to Katrina Monton for being with us, for sharing your insights and expertise. And so without further ado, I would like to also thank our senior trial attorney, Aria Vaughn, from the Educational Opportunities section of the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Aria has been with DOJ for the last 9 years. Her work has focused on addressing sex discrimination in schools, and we're so grateful for her dedicated leadership. So thanks, Aria, for all you do, and over to you.
Thank you, Director Hidalgo, for that introduction. Earlier this month, the Educational Opportunities section, working with a local assistant U.S. attorney, announced a settlement agreement with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. This settlement, which addresses coach and athlete abuse and the systemic breakdowns that allowed a coach to groom and abuse athletes for years, comes on the heels of EOS's 2021 agreement with San Jose State University. In that case, EOS found that an athletic trainer similarly abused their position and sexually assaulted student athletes for years. Both matters demonstrate the imperative need for institutions to understand the circumstances that create opportunities for employees to misuse their power to mentally and physically abuse students and take steps to prevent such harms. These cases also show that robust and effective Title IX compliance can create a check on individual power and properly position institutions to keep students safe. EOS enforces Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1974, which protects students from discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs and activities. Under Title IX, the institution must respond to known sexual harassment that creates a hostile environment. But it is the institution, not any one person, that is ultimately responsible for discrimination. As a result, our lens is always trained on what institutional conditions allowed this head coach to amass power and abuse students for years. UMBC's swimming and diving team includes men and women with one head coach at the helm. During our 3-year investigation, members of the UMBC's swimming and diving team alleged that their former head coach sexually assaulted male student athletes and failed to address known serious dating violence against female student athletes. That coach was himself a UMBC student athlete who swam with the very team he would later coach for over 20 years. During those 20 years, he grew the swimming and diving program in size and revenue and became one of the university's winningest coaches. In addition to coaching the swimming and diving team, he oversaw the university's aquatic center, youth camps, and swim club. Virtually everyone we interviewed recognized the head coach was adept at fostering alumni relationships and fundraising. He also cultivated close personal relationships with high-ranking university officials and administrators. His reputation and visibility earned him the moniker Mr. UMBC. Like many esteemed coaches, he became synonymous with the university itself. As the university's flagship coach, this head coach enjoyed deference even when his behavior should have raised concerns for the university. Our investigation showed that it was well known among student athletes and the athletics department that the head coach invited students over to his home for sleepovers and private meals, took students for haircuts, developed a close personal relationship with a student athlete who the coach later hired and allowed to live in his home, and used locker and restrooms designated for student athletes while they were present, and even though he had access to employee-only facilities. Like all head coaches, this coach exerted control over many aspects of the students' lives. He had a hand in their scholarships, eligibility, housing, academics, conduct violations, and interpersonal conflicts. But this coach's control went further. He demanded to know everything about students on his team, including family dynamics, dating and sex lives, and health conditions unrelated to academic performance, like sexually transmitted infections. Though many coaches concern themselves with the general well-being of their team, students reported that this coach's involvement in their lives was extreme. Students and staff likened the team culture to a funnel, with athletes and staff bringing all information to the coach for his sole counsel. The head coach positioned himself to deal with any and all team issues, even when he should have involved other university resources, like student conduct, residential life, the counseling center, and critically, the Title IX coordinator. Those offices also knew the head coach undercut their authority by failing to involve them in relevant issues. Yet they never corrected the coach and his staff's noncompliance with reporting obligations. As a result, the funnel created a team culture where student athletes believed they had nowhere to go but to the head coach. Many believed he weaponized information to control and manipulate team dynamics in a manner that harmed female student athletes and enabled him to sexually abuse male student athletes. Male student athletes told us that the coach's grooming behavior started soon after they enrolled. The coach started by telling them he was happy they were on the team. Quickly, those affirmations became private texts saying, "I love you." During practice on the pool deck, the coach began with behaviors some may consider innocuous: a hug, a tap on the stomach or butt to say, "Good swim," rubbing their sore shoulders. But quickly, the behavior progressed. The coach began hugging student athletes from behind, pressing his groin into their buttocks while they wore only Speedos. He kissed their necks and told them they looked hot. First years asked upperclassmen about the head coach, and they said, "Well, that's just how he is." Once those behaviors were normalized, the head coach's conduct progressed further. He used COVID-19 temperature checks as an occasion to grab students' genitalia. He pulled them into his office and massaged and kissed their groins. The head coach followed student athletes into the men's locker rooms and bathrooms, where he exposed himself and asked to see students' genitalia. Students even alleged that the coach used a locker with direct view into the showers, where he kept a camera, possibly to film students showering. While the men endured this sexual harassment, their female teammates experienced a different form of sex discrimination. The head coach encouraged teammates to date each other, leading several student athletes and athletics employees to say that the coach encouraged, quote, "swimcest." Students believed this was another method of involving himself in their most intimate relationships. When several women attempted to end relationships with their swimmer boyfriends, the men resorted to dating violence, which included stalking, sexual coercion, and other problematic behaviors. Rather than report this to Title IX as required, the head coach attempted to mediate, forcing the former couples to meet with him where he berated the women and excused the man's behavior. These mediations prolonged the abuse, and though other universities knew of this tactic, they did not intervene. Just as student athletes understood they were to bring any and every issue to the head coach, so did the assistant coaches who worked for him. Several admitted knowing that female student athletes experienced dating violence, but did nothing beyond referring women back to the head coach. By creating an insular environment with all information funneling to him, the head coach created an environment ripe for abuse. The structure and culture of the athletics department deepened this insularity. Our investigation showed that the department maintained a strict chain of command where information was shared up through levels of supervisors, but not out to other offices who may act as a check on their power. The department even surveyed athletes anonymously, but did not review or otherwise follow up on the surveys of the head coach, which were replete with pleas for help from graduating athletes. The story of how all of this broke loose is remarkable. In fall 2020, another woman was physically assaulted by her swimmer boyfriend and the head coach attempted to protect him from any consequences. When other student athletes saw her at practice covered in bruises, they realized, quote, he would rather let a woman die than report. Soon after, the coach instructed student athletes to lie about COVID exposure and symptoms. The students reported this to the athletics director, who placed the head coach on leave. Student athletes began to recognize the environment was destructive and took action to protect themselves and each other. Having some distance from the coach gave student athletes perspective and a sense of safety. One by one, they began to report the abuse that they had endured for years to other trusted adults who finally reported the coach's behavior to the university's Title IX coordinator. Months later, these same students came to DOJ to share their experiences and express how their coach's stature at the university enabled him to abuse them in myriad ways for many years. They suspected that the coach's close relationship with university administrators made him untouchable. And sadly, our investigation showed that high-ranking university administrators did protect the coach, leaving students vulnerable to his continued abuse. In 2015 and 2019, students circumvented their coach's funnel and reported sexual harassment to other athletic staff. And yet the head coach's supervisors warned the coach of allegations, allowing and at times helping him conceal evidence and skirt any meaningful investigation into his behavior. In other words, our investigation confirmed students' worst suspicions that the university would protect the coach to the detriment of their well-being. It is this institutional betrayal that necessitated a settlement that addresses the system-wide conditions that allowed this head coach's grooming and abuse. Our agreement requires the university to review its own Title IX efforts to determine what is needed for effective compliance. Just designating a Title IX coordinator does not make a compliant program. The university must equip that person with the autonomy necessary to take action, even against high-ranking and revered members of the university community. They must also have the resources necessary to effectively respond to allegations of sexual harassment and retaliation, and support involved parties through that process. To assist with this goal, the university will hire a full-time employee to provide confidential emotional support to community members who have experienced sexual assault. The university will create a policy that will clearly outline the boundaries of coaches' behavior outside of their athletic expertise. This will ensure that coaches, assistant coaches, staff, and students understand the appropriate limitation of a coach's role. The agreement requires the university to review and follow up on surveys of athletes so that it may correct culture and climate issues on teams. Throughout the agreement, there are mechanisms for students to be involved in reshaping the university's response to and prevention of sex discrimination. For so long, these students' voices were dampened by the funnel, but our agreement will make sure they are heard. Finally, UMBC agreed to pay over $4 million to student athletes who experience sex discrimination. This agreement will help UMBC reform its system and develop tools it needs to keep students safe. If you're interested in learning more about this and other EOS cases, you can see the links that we will send out following this presentation. I'll turn it back over to Latanisha to introduce our keynote speakers.
Thank you so much, Aria. And for the work that you've highlighted that has springboarded our conversation today. It really highlights the key issues that the Civil Rights Division Educational Opportunity Section is seeing in its work. To continue on with our discussion, our esteemed panelists bring two unique perspectives to this conversation. But before I introduce our panelists, I just want to remind attendees that to ask questions during the discussion portion of the webinar, utilize the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen, and we'll ensure that the panelists are able to see the questions posed. So for our first panelist, Emily Austin, JD, is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Specialist at the Army of Survivors, TAUS. Oh. And she works at TAUS to create systems and policy change to improve the response to abuse in sport and prevention abuse, response to abuse in sport and prevention abuse in sport. TAUS was founded by athlete survivors of Larry Nassar and works to center survivor experiences and trauma-informed approaches to end abuse in sport. Hold tight. I just need to cut on my camera. I realized my camera wasn't on. Sorry, Emily. All right. So Emily works to bring thoughtful and authentic change to systems, organization, and individuals to end gender-based violence in sport and all systems. She graduated from UCLA with a Bachelor's of Arts in Women's Studies in English. Emily received her law degree from USC Gould School of Law and has been working in the ending gender-based violence field for over 20 years. Our second panelist, Katrina Montan, is a doctoral candidate in the Social Organizational Psychology program at Columbia University. Prior to pursuing graduate studies, she was a professional athlete on the Canadian Women's National Water Polo team, assisting Canada in reaching the podium at 6 major international events. Following her retirement from Team Canada, she completed a Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology at McGill University and worked as a clinical counselor in her hometown, Montreal, Canada. Katrina is a safe sport advocate, sitting on athlete advisories in both Canada and the United States. Her work and research focus on leveraging organizational culture to promote psychological safety, wellness, and belonging within high-performance environments. She often works at the intersection of organizational psychology and sport, but has also worked in the medical and military fields. Her work has been presented nationally and internationally, including at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Emily and Katrina, can you delve more into this topic and help us understand the unique dynamics of this issue?
Thank you, Lottie. We're so happy to be here today to talk about this important issue. And actually, the learnings from the recent case that settled will tie beautifully into our discussion of the dynamics of control and abuse in sport. We'd like to start with just an acknowledge of privilege at the up front. So both of us are white women. I'm coming from the land of the Chumash in Los Angeles. And we're just acknowledging that we've had the privilege to be able to look and study in this area and also to call attention to these issues because of coming from a place of privilege and being able to distance ourselves from the repercussions of speaking up. We know that for survivors in this space, it is incredibly difficult to speak up about abuse in sport. And so we just wanted to start there and head off to a deeper dive into these dynamics. We're going to set the stage about a systemic approach, look at a power and control wheel that is specific to abuse in sport, review grooming, highlighted, of course, by the recent case and beyond, and then the importance of culture and research findings, a perspective about harm and recommendations. And I'll hand it over to Katrina.
Okay, so we'd like to start the session today by sharing some stats about harm and abuse in sport. So nearly 6 million children and young adults in the United States are survivors of sexual violence through their participation in sports. This translates to nearly 13% of all student athletes and likely many more. As we know, crime is consistently underreported. Most recent data suggests that up to 80% of American athletes in sport report experiencing psychological harm, and up to 21% of athletes report experiencing physical harm. What we also know is based on recent research less than 15% of athletes report experiencing harm in sports. So these numbers are likely underestimates of the actual numbers and the prevalence data of harm. So Emily and I have intentionally framed this session taking a systemic perspective. So much of the existing research in this area has focused on harm at the individual level, which is akin to the bad apple analogy. So a bad coach, abusive coach, bad apple analogy. More recently, there's been an effort made to think more broadly. So thinking at the organizational level. So this would be akin to the bad barrel analogy, which is an organizational issue. However, the systemic perspective would be one of a comparison to an apple orchard. So the consideration of the whole system, including the various levels. So this doesn't ignore the bad apple or the bad barrel, so the individual or organizational levels. Instead, it provides a holistic perspective where we can consider all of these levels. As you see, each level is situated within the other. So individual members of an organization are situated within a group, department, or discipline. So the athletics department would sit in there, which is then situated within an organizational context. So in this case, that would be a school. So elementary, middle, high school, university, college, perhaps, which is then situated within an industry. So in this situation, we could think about the educational system, higher education, school athletics generally, sport generally, which is then situated in an external environment. So in this context, that would be the United States. These different components of the system are interrelated such that a change in one level leads to changes in the other. So it is important to consider the various levels when thinking about harm and safety and reflect on what level we are thinking about when we think about a specific issue and how the other levels may be relevant or affected from a specific action. So for example, if you're removing an abusive coach, this has an immediate consequence at the individual level, of course, but also might have ramifications at the department level, university level, just like a change in the industry level. So an educational systems change like Title IX will have impacts across all the other levels. So it's a feedback loop, which you can see demonstrated with the arrows here. So there's movement across those levels with an incident or an issue or action at one of the various levels. Emily?
Yes, and we also wanted to highlight, this is very similar to public health approach to prevention and intervention, using what you may have heard of as the socio-ecological model, seeing how things are nested within each other, and then taking targeted approaches that may be primary before the abuse has happened, secondary immediately after abuse or when abuse is threatened to happen, and tertiary prevention, which is immediately after abuse has happened. So we really encourage a multi-form and a multi-framework approach and viewing of the system. It's very dynamic and it crosses across multiple disciplines. The next piece is really to outline a little bit about power and responsibility. So especially in sports culture, in all systems, but in sport culture in particular, there's this idea of actual versus perceived power. In educational systems in general, students turn to professors for advice, for help in their careers, for those important letters and recommendations and that mentorship. And even those professors may not understand the power they hold in those students' eyes. Similarly, in coaching dynamics, the coaches have, you can hear, up to almost complete control over student-athlete lives. And they may not realize it, but it's perceived as power and it affects student-athletes that way. So for the coaching dynamic, which we often use as a catch-all, but we know that there are a lot of people of influence in the sports world. There's the coach to student athlete relationship. There's the college administrator to student relationship, professor to student, even TAs to student. And then there's also the medical and support staff in athletic programs. We know from the Larry Nassar case that can have far-reaching impact into the sports culture as well. And then I also want to just throw in here, there are peer hierarchies. We know that a senior student may have more power on a team than a first-year student. And we've seen those play out in forms of normalized abuse within sport cultures. And there's also Title IX. So we know that responsible employees are required to report if they are seen as someone that can take action to intervene and prevent abuse. And student athletes may not know that someone is a responsible employee. So making sure that we are clear about folks' duties and responsibilities, and that we also are transparent in how we share that information with other student athletes and other persons in the school student pipeline. Next piece is a tool to help you all think about power and control dynamics in sport. The Army of Survivors has created a power and control wheel. If you've worked in domestic violence and sexual violence work, you will recognize the idea of this wheel and the spokes that go into it. Today, we're going to just quickly go through various parts of this wheel to give you a working knowledge of the impacts on a student athlete's life. The first part is minimizing, denying, and blaming. And we see this happen when coaches, guardians, people of influence in sport say the abuse is part of appropriate athletic training, that it's appropriate for the touching, it's appropriate to invade someone's personal space, it's appropriate to look at someone's body, and starts to normalize that type of minimizing and blaming. I'd also just put here that sometimes athletes' physical strength and athleticism will be weaponized against them. So, having persons that have been abused on football teams and using a heteronormative culture framework that says that men can't be abused. And look, this is a linebacker. He could definitely never be taken advantage of. And that is a minimizing and denying mechanism that is used to silence athlete voices. The next piece is coercion. So we see this turning up with persons of influence in sport by using manipulative tactics and persistent boundary crossing to initiate abuse and maintain power and control. And those coercion techniques can really extend to introducing performance enhancers and steroids, coercing behavior in order to get play time and be able to be a part of the team or be in the front line, the first line of a team. Next is isolation. And we see this in the University of Maryland case. We see this in nearly every case that has come across my desk around survivor abuse in sport. That there's a purposeful isolation from family and other support members. And sometimes it's put under the tactic of team building, right? So like what will happen is a coach will be like, you guys have to be like, you guys are the family now. You're the team. And that means shutting out every other piece of their life. And isolation makes an easier and more vulnerable target for abuse. Next is gaining trust of the athlete and the caregiver. And we know that a lot of athletes come into sport as young children. And so gaining the access to that young person is through often the caregiver, parent, and guardian. So this can look like gifts, being able to just be there for the family, taking on the personal weight of what's going on in the family, understanding the dynamics, becoming the close confidant of the athlete and of the caregivers, so that they're found to be a trustworthy person and a support person in that family's life. It may be, asking, as we saw in the case that was just described, asking inappropriate personal questions to gain personal knowledge. The work of that coach was really to funnel all information to him and make him the central source of information. And we see that as a way of gaining trust and then using it to connect to coercion. The next is threats and rewards. And we know in coaching systems and in sports dynamics that there are a huge number of incentives that coaches use, some healthy and not so healthy. We know that playtime is, especially in elite levels, an important piece of this. And that is at the sole discretion of the coach. So threatening and rewarding playtime, rewarding and threatening access to sport equipment or gym time, being able to control in the school environment, access in dorms and housing, and the entire life of a student athlete. Those can be used as threats and rewards to control and silence student voice. The next piece is around heteronormativity, sexism, and cisism. So just recognizing that we are still operating in a world where sexism is prevalent, and in sport, it often can have a really detrimental impact. As you saw in the University of Maryland case, the female and the male teams were divided and weaponized against each other. Relationships and heteronormativity, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships were used to control behavior, and also hiding behind heteronormativity that boys are not capable of being abused, which is completely untrue, but makes it even harder for boys and men to come forward and talk about the abuse that they've experienced and seek help and seek accountability. The next piece is authority. And this is tricky and very, very important in sporting cultures because coaching is about authority. The coach is supposed to know and is supposed to be providing expertise in the sport. That can be taken to an abusive level when it becomes the coach's way or no way. And coaching systems are set up this way. It's almost in a military hierarchy type setup where students are looking to what the coach is saying, and they know that their scholarships and their access to sport depends on following the coach's orders. It's really important that, and we'll talk about this later, how we help coaches reframe their authority and help them be more compassionate in the way they address coaching and supporting student athletes and all athletes. The final piece of the final spoke in the wheel is grooming. And we pulled it aside in a separate slide as well, because we know that grooming has a high impact on student athletes that are often isolated away from their families, maybe for the first time. They may have come into this sport as a child, being told that they have to do exactly what their coach says and to not ask questions, to just be a good athlete. And we see that in that isolation, grooming can take root. It doesn't, what I always say in these circles is, it's not like in an abusive relationship, someone came on and punched you in the face on the first date, right? Grooming takes time and it's purposeful. It's that little incremental boundary pushing. It's that, the pat on the back that you did a good job, turning into a shoulder rub that you really didn't want, turning into a hug that is a little too long. And it's starting to wear away on your boundaries. You start to see everyone else it's okay with everyone else in the room, in the locker room, so it must be just fine. You start to deny what your own gut is telling you. Grooming is not sudden. It takes purposeful time. And in cases of perpetrators that have multiple survivors left in their wake, we know that they pick out vulnerable people on purpose to groom because they know they're isolated and they may not have those ways of checking the boundary behavior. One example of this is the use of international students. So having a coach go internationally and recruit and bring students that then are not only away from their family, they're away from their culture, from their known government, from the way they know how to operate in the world. They may be also having language barriers. So that extreme isolation is a gateway to even more long-term and systemic grooming behaviors. Who else can they turn to? And when that person that they turn to is harming them slowly over time, it kind of wears away on what forms of support may exist, even within and out the system. So unless we're really mindful of those tactics in grooming, we won't be able to intercede and stop those grooming techniques. We'll talk about recommendations later, but personal autonomy and boundary setting is central for our students, for our athletes, and for everyone in society. Being able to set those boundaries, keep them, and express them without retaliation and detriment is going to be critical to solving this issue.
Alrighty. So next, we're going to get into a little bit about my research. But before I get into it, I just wanted to share that my research stems from my lived experience in sport as a national team athlete for over a decade, where I had 3 coaches who were eventually removed for harmful coaching behavior. When I got to graduate school, I was trying to understand how it was possible that we could have had so many bad apples. I wondered how it was possible that one coach could be removed and replaced with another who could behave in similar ways. I likened it to a bicycle wheel where a spoke breaks and then you replace the spoke, and then the same spoke breaks and you replace the spoke again. At one point, you start to think maybe it's the
En un
wheel.
punto usted empieza a pensar,
Maybe it's the wheel that's faulty and not the spokes at all. So I thought maybe there was something in the culture of sport which was enabling these harmful and problematic coaching behaviors, which brings me to my research. So I'm in a non-sport related program. So I'm one of the only ones exploring sport organizations. It's been extremely helpful because I've been able to learn from other organizational contexts. So my research specifically focuses on the role of organizational culture in the normalization of harm in elite sport environments. So organizational culture, simply put, is usually the way we do things around here. So it's the way you feel in an organization, it's the attitudes, the beliefs, the behaviors that become normal and taken for granted within a work environment. So I used a framework for my research, which had been validated in other environments that were historically male-dominated, hierarchical in nature, where there was high levels of competition. I thought that this framework, because it was validated, might be prevalent based on my experiences as an athlete. So this environment or this organizational culture is categorized by these 4 norms here. So the first one is really a sole focus on work. So a lack of sport-life balance. So really putting sport above all else. The second is a concealing of emotions, vulnerability, mental health struggles. So anything that would be considered weakness. So this would be likened to mental toughness. The third one is showing unrelenting strength and endurance. So working long hours, doing extra. Here in sport, we could see this as pushing through injury and illness. And the last norm is about winners and losers. And basically this speaks to the idea that within the sport environment or in these types of cultures, there's always going to be a winner and a loser. And that dynamic upkeeps and upholds kind of these other norms. So what we found was not only that these norms were present within sport environments, but that they were often justified by a win at all costs mentality, where high performance and winning medals takes precedence above all else, including athletes' health, well-being, and safety. It's the why that so often justifies the dehumanization of athletes. So our research found these norms were present in sport. And what we also found was that it led to various adverse outcomes. So athletes in these environments, both at the time they were in them and years later, reported experiencing higher levels of stress, higher levels of anxiety and depression, higher levels of body image issues and disordered eating, issues with intimate interpersonal relationships, a decreased level of psychological safety, decreased level of well-being, decreased levels of self-esteem. And interestingly and promisingly, what we found was that this environment and athletes that reported that they experienced these norms did not report experiencing performing any better. So obviously more research is necessary to really make this link and validate it, but this result was promising. This research is important because it empirically validates the importance of culture and what role it is playing in creating a safe sport environment. So for this next slide, information from this slide comes from a recent book chapter I wrote on human rights in sport, where I mapped the antecedents or risk factors of harm using this systems model, using research and gray literature available. So Emily and I will go through each level of the system and kind of point to key issues that exist within each one. There's going to be a lot of information shared here, so we're going to go slowly and go through it one level at a time. So first would be the prioritization of the 1%. So the top performers over all else. So top performers are praised, rewarded, and endorsed, and the entire system is most often centered on that idea. So funding comes with that, which we'll get into a little bit later. So instead of being centered on sport as a vehicle for making friends, sport as a means for being healthy and fit, sport for participation and fun, what we often see is an over prioritization of the top performers and of winning. Next is the normalization of harm, which could arguably be in the external environment as well, maybe at all the different levels. But I think in sport, we are up against something a little different. Harm in sport is romanticized and normalized beyond just the sport industry. Sport touches all of us, and so the normalization of harm in sport does too. When we see athletes vomiting on the sidelines in a movie, we tend to think that it's a sign of hard work. When we're at a hockey game and a player gets pushed up against the glass, we are all on our feet clapping because it's a good game. When a coach is yelling at an athlete, we believe it is necessary on some level because that athlete needs to be pushed to their maximum capacity. However, all of these things are signs of harm and potentially a lack of respect for the athlete. So we see this normalization of harm in the industry, in the external environment, and within the organizational and individual levels as well. The culture of sport here kind of straddles both of the organizational level and the industry level. I'm not going to belabor this point because I've already kind of touched on it on the previous slide. But we see that the culture of sport normalizes harm within the educational system, within athletic institutions, and by society as well. So that's why it's straddling that line between the two. Next, self-regulation and silos. So this speaks to the idea that sport often operates in silos and has a self-regulating component to it, where we often see a lack of oversight and accountability, which of course has relevant consequences for the perpetuation of harm. Lastly, this idea of socialization. So it kind of touches on what Emily had shared earlier about grooming on the previous slide, where grooming takes time and it's part of a socialization process whereby you're conditioned to think that something is normal and or acceptable over time. So this does not happen overnight. Oftentimes we enter the sport system as children, and so this socialization process happens pretty early sometimes. One example that I can share from my research was that there was an athlete that was joining an aesthetic sport on the national team level, and she showed up for the first day of training, and it was a 10-hour day, Monday through Friday, with a larger break in the middle of the day for lunch. It was her first day. She thought it was a long day, so she brought a lunch consisting of a sandwich and fruit and snacks and vegetables, only to take out her lunch, look around and see that many of the other women, especially the more veteran athletes, were only eating a handful of almonds or a bag of dry cereal. So on the first day, this seemed stark, and she realized it, she noticed it. But over time, she herself began to eat less and less, developing an eating disorder, self-esteem issues. Only a year later to see a new athlete join the squad and bring a sandwich and wonder to herself, how long will it take her to just bring almonds? So this is the idea that these behaviors take a little while to become normalized. And it's the idea that when you're in a space where something happens and the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the more that happens, the less you're going to react, the less your body is going to react to those things because they do become normalized over time. Right, Emily, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, that story gives me chills still. And it's really interesting too, because we know that eating disorders, ideas of self and identity are so critical as a vulnerability to being abused as well. So we know it goes hand in hand. It's almost a chicken and egg piece that we see with surviving this type of abuse. And at the individual level, we see demographic risk factors. So we see that what happens is the most vulnerable are the most vulnerable. We see vulnerabilities tied to race, socioeconomics, international nationality status, disability. And we see that those are risk factors that are, you know, even more prominent in being vulnerable to abuse. The next piece is power imbalances. And we do have, as we've had a whole slide on, talked about these power imbalances that are set up inherently to sports culture, right? So there are persons that are teaching and coaching this sport, and that means that they have power over the people they are teaching and coaching. The next is fear. And fear has a physical aspect, the fear of physical harm, but also a huge fear of retaliation and what speaking out or complaining about circumstances could do to their career and their life. And student athlete and athlete life in many sports is limited to a certain period of time. And then you age out of a sport in a lot of sports. You might want to become a coach. You may want to take your skills to the rec level and help there. You may ultimately have a family and want to support your kids in a sport. What happens for survivors and athlete survivors is recognizing that if they say something, they will not have access to that career path and to those future accesses to sport because of the insular environment and the fear of retaliation. The next piece is athletes enter the system as children. We touched on this before. That makes them very vulnerable and susceptible to grooming behaviors. And the conflicts of interest is the next piece. Conflicts of interest are huge because if you've watched any of these stories, you'll see how sports are interconnected at various levels. So the national coach could also have their own club that they're working on. They could also be, have a role in the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. They could also have a role at the university. So you see that it's ripe for conflict of interest. And the final piece is identity foreclosure. And that comes really to the idea that your identity as an athlete is your central identity. And that's the only thing you're working on. And it makes it very, very important to protect that identity at all costs, at the expense of other identities.
So the last three that we'll cover is really about the external environment, risk factors in the external environment. So first would be willful blindness. So that relates to those in the training environment, other adults, trainers, more senior athletes, assistant coaches, parents who observe harmful behavior and do nothing. They perpetuate this idea that the behavior is normal and acceptable within that environment. So this could be called willful blindness or blind complicity. So that, what I just spoke to, is obviously at the individual level. But it can happen at the societal level as well. So by failing to institute policies, laws, practices that would ensure athlete safety, by failing to address harm done in a swift and just manner, by failing to hold those who need to be held accountable, those would all be examples of complicit blindness at the societal or in the external environment. Funding contingent on performance really goes hand in hand with the prioritization of the 1%. So this aligns with the idea that funding is often allocated on performance and is often removed from those teams, athletes, systems, organizations who are no longer performing. So this obviously actively contributes to the reinforcement of the win at all costs mentality. And lastly, we see a lack of funding for resources related to athlete and coach mental health, professional development. Those are just two examples, and they're not usually available within the system. And so what we see is that those within it often do suffer, are not up to date on the best practices. And so this can obviously have, of course, detrimental outcomes as well for those within it. So I think we're going to take a pause here.
Yes, you have 2 questions. So let me get to those questions for you. All right, so the first question for you is, do you think that variations in reporting responsibilities under state and federal law contributes to the lack of and/or questioning of reporting by those affected by abuse in collegiate athletics?
Lottie, could you repeat it just one more time? I want to get the beginning of that.
No worries. Do you think that the variations in reporting responsibilities under state and federal law contributes to the lack of and/or questioning of reporting by those affected by abuse in collegiate athletics?
I have a lot of thoughts about the various reporting requirements, and what we come back to, and you'll see this in our recommendations again and again, is the need for transparency in the reporting process, through what happens when you report, who to report to, and then what kind of supports you have through that investigation or whatever happens next. And so part of the biggest problem is that we have state laws that require a certain level of reporting, especially around sexual abuse of children. We have national laws, and then we have a Title IX. So we have various requirements that are different. What has been helpful for survivors is having contact to someone that understands those different levels of reporting early on in the process. So each state has advocates that know their state laws. And they're great resources for this work and survivors understanding their pathway. We'll talk about a trauma-informed approach, but the key piece of that is trustworthiness and transparency. So how can we make sure that our school academic settings are keyed in on the various levels of reporting and the intersections of systems? There are ways. We just have to spend a little time, money, and resource and prioritize making the connections to our community advocates.
Thank you
Do
for
you have
that.
anything to
Katrina, you
add?
want to weigh in on it, or I'll go to the next one? All right.
I think we'll get to it too in the recommendations.
So the second question is the power and control wheel with detailed behaviors going to be made available after this session? Maybe Emily, you can
Oh.
plug where to find it.
Yes, you can visit thearmyofsurvivors.org, all spelled out, and search for the power and control wheel. It is available now in an interactive place and also as a downloadable, printable handout. So it's free and available for everyone. And we'll include a link in the PowerPoint slides that go out after this.
That's all the questions for now.
Okay, so we will get on to the next part, which is the recommendations. So as a way to model this, Emily and I wanted to start the recommendation section by grounding it in the athlete voice. So as I asked athletes in my study what they wished would have been different or what changes they might envision for the sports system, so we thought we would start by highlighting their voices and their recommendations for change. So first was a desire for increased accountability and transparency. So to Emily's point that she just made, they wanted to see that across all levels of the sports system. Second, athletes shared that the entire sports system should be more athlete-centered, where the athlete voice is amplified and considered across all levels of decision-making. Third, they felt there was the need for societal and systems-wide change, ranging from adapting and updating coaching philosophies, which we'll touch on, to redefining what success looks like in high-performance sport. And lastly, they felt there was the need for increased support for professional development, training, and other access to other resources for coaches and athletes alike. So you will notice as Emily moves through the rest of our recommendations that they're also grounded in the athlete voice and very much aligned with what I've just shared. Pass back to you, Emily.
Thank you. I love that part of us coming together to do this work is realizing the athletes that you talk to, they're the same, have the same concerns of the athletes that the Army of Survivors has talked to. And one of the major solutions we have put forward as the Army of Survivors and in this work in general is bringing an awareness of trauma and being trauma informed at all levels. This is different than trauma sensitivity, where you may just acknowledge that there is trauma and it is something that exists. Being trauma informed really is centered in making that part of practice, acknowledging. We tried to model that today. I'm going to show you a little behind the scenes by having advisory content warning, so that before you hear the details of that settlement case, you're kind of prepared that, hey, this could be detailed information that could make me feel uncomfortable, and letting us acknowledge it as a system and say, we encourage you to take care of yourself. The first piece of being trauma informed, though, is understanding what trauma is. And trauma is an event or ongoing circumstances that overwhelm. They're experiences that are stressful, frightening, distressing, and they undercut our ability of having self-control, having control over ourselves. That's why a lot of the recommendations we'll put forward to you today are about how do we place control back in survivors' hands. This is a critical piece of survivors' healing, moving through the trauma that has happened to them. So there's 4 F's of trauma responses that are not controllable by the prefrontal cortex, which is this front part, very small part of our brain. The prefrontal cortex is the part that develops last in life, and our rudimentary and emotional and hormonal responses are really in the back of the brain. And that's where we start in life. That's how we can survive the metaphorical tiger jumping out to attack us. So in those responses, we have a fight response, which is to fight back. It can look like rage and anger. It can also look like bullying other people and intimidating other people. So sometimes some of those acting out behaviors are really related to a trauma response. Then we have a flight response, which is a moving away from, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, through anxiety and panic, worry, rumination, and a dwelling in perfectionism. We see this a lot with our athletes. We see that drive to be perfect is kind of drilled into them, and can be anxiety produced and connected to anxiety. Then we have freeze, which is a trauma response of passivity, of not reacting, of disassociating, being angry, numb, or stuck. And we see this, of course, with traumas that occur across the board, but sexual assault, one of the key pieces of this work in the 20, 30, 40 years ago was recognizing that all survivors can't fight back in that moment. So what does that mean? That is a trauma response. It's something that they aren't able to control. And then fawn. And this is a newer F. You may be familiar with the first 3, but this one really ties into that coercion, boundary breakdowns that happen over time. So fawn is when you attach to something that is causing you harm, right? So identity confusion, a lack of boundaries, codependency. These are types of responses to that trauma that actually tend to have someone attached to the thing that is causing them harm. We included a jumping off point in our resources for you to consider a deeper dive into trauma-informed care. And that really is our first recommendation, is that our school systems and our sports systems take a deep dive into trauma-informed processes, where they're recognizing that trauma is impacting most of the population. They're realizing that those trauma effects are going to be showing up every day with someone, and critically, they're responding in some way. So they're creating structures, supports, even training within the whole society, the whole group, and the whole organization is critical to that. So a pause there. There's a whole webinar just tied up with the trauma-informed approach. The next recommendation is tied in with trauma-informed care, because if you take a look at that, you'll see that the first piece of that, one of the most critical pieces as a survivor advocate, is providing survivors empowerment, voice, and choice. And that means that there's no wrong way to report abuse. There's supports and wraparound care for persons that are reporting and part of an investigation, that there are different pathways to accountability. And that survivor voice is actually important and recognized as a form of expertise. Central to our work is really making sure we understand that survivor athletes are experts in what happened to them. And that is critical for changing and preventing what happened to them from happening to anybody else. And then the next piece is, fostering this psychologically safe space. And that's going to take some change to our sporting culture. Katrina, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Sure. I often work with sport organizations, and a lot of the people that I meet, they share they don't feel like they have the authority in their role to change things. So we all do have some authority and some power, whether that's in the responsibility to report or in your influence in terms of your relationships. And so it's about trying to create that psychologically safe space in sport where real and honest dialogue can happen. So this could look like, instead of staying silent in a meeting, you share a concern, you disagree with something openly, you want to speak up, but you feel nervous. So you find a few other colleagues, 2 or 3 other colleagues to share together. It's this idea where we normalize making mistakes, showing up and being authentic. And I think this human-centered piece is really quick. I don't think anyone working in the sports system is in the business of removing challenge, right? So I think it's more about building up the human capacity and the human being to withstand challenge. And so I know I often get that pushback around, how can we do this without pushing the athletes? I don't think anyone is saying to not push the athletes. I think instead what we're saying is, how can we make the athletes resilient, strong, give them the resources necessary to process stress, cope with anxiety, give them a break to recover. So that's what this piece is really, really talking about. All right, Emily, back to you.
And I'm cognizant of time. We knew that we had too much, and we do. But to just follow up on these recommendations, we really wanted you to walk away with them. Incredibly central is access to confidential services and supports, so people can navigate the reporting systems, so people understand the mandatory and discretionary reporting laws. And you saw in the University of Maryland's case that confidential support person became part of the solution in that settlement. Next is anonymous and active feedback systems, ways that athletes, student athletes, coaches can provide feedback and get action if something is starting to veer off the path of healthy behaviors. Then finally, active response to and prevention of retaliation. Nearly every athlete I've talked to and have shared stories about their fear of retaliation and being pushed out of the sport completely for coming forward. So we need to make sure people know that Title IX also covers retaliation, and that our academic institutions are going to enforce that anti-retaliation response. Then finally, we have changing sporting culture. There are new tools coming out. The Army of Survivors is piloting Compassionate Coach, which talks about how do we change coaching dynamics where we can present challenge in a healthy way that doesn't involve necessarily tearing down a person psychologically and building them back up into a certain image. We can work with students and athletes to get their best performance. We don't have to be in a violent, adverse, and no pain, no gain mentality in sports. We'll also include a lot of links to resources to just start you off. But our contact information is also shared at the end of this, so you can contact and reach out to us as well. And I'll hand it over to you, Katrina, and we can take a few minutes of questions.
All right. We don't have any questions in the chat, but I will just open it up for others. If you have questions now, this is the time to ask. You can put your questions in the Q&A section of the presentation, of the platform. So I'll give you a question right now, Emily and Katrina, and then we'll see if others come with questions. So a question I have is, coaches like faculty often believe that they are subject matter experts in their field, right? And can be, resistant to sort of changing their methods. How do you recommend approaching coaches and or faculty about this conversation without kind of veering into their area of expertise or veering into, you know, their perceived expertise?
Do you want me to start, Katrina, or? I think it has to start as a conversation about kind of what system do you really want, and how do you build trust with your student athletes, and acknowledging their expertise, of course, but bringing in trauma-informed expertise at the same time. There are lots of ways to think about this. It's a development of soft skill, not just output, like not just getting the win, but are our students learning? I mean, that's the other joy or goal of collegiate athletics is you are within a institution of learning. You're supposed to be encouraging learning and growth, and encouraging our leaders in that space to have open mindset where they're willing to learn and grow and maybe change and try new approaches in their coaching strategies. The old ways are not necessarily the best ways. And we have to encourage coaches to do better. They're not just extracting an output from a robot. They're working with a whole person. How can they do that job better? Sheena, I think you have some experience with it too, so I'd love you to chime in.
Yeah, I think my answer would be very similar to that. I think coaching is a privilege. And so I think having access to those young minds and all that sport can give, there's so much potential with sports, so many benefits that we know they're well documented. And so I think first and foremost, I just always like to acknowledge that piece. But I think that's where that psychologically safe space kind of comes in, and some of that education and resources. Sometimes the coaches have been trained in that very environment. So maybe normalizing the fear on doing something different, trying something new, that definitely takes some courage and bravery sometimes. And so I think starting with a conversation is a great place to start, and kind of envisioning what you want for your team. And I think, oftentimes we don't really think of psychological safety in sport, but that is never the goal. The goal is actually performance. That's just a means to get there. And so if your athlete is telling you, I can be pushed harder, or I don't respond well to that, you're really thinking about that performance bottom line at the end of the day. So I think my answer to that would be very similar to what Emily had shared.
Thank you for that. We have a question we have a question for you. So the question is, if someone is going through this trauma of an incident, what do you think is the best way to help this person confront their fear or trauma and get a positive feedback?
So I think helping the person connect to their own power is central. I know it sounds kind of loosey-goosey, but connecting to their own power and trying to decide their own pathway is going to be critical. And you can only do that if you understand what is going on around you. I highly recommend connecting someone to a confidential advocate, because so when you're with a confidential advocate, they don't have to report to anybody. They may be some child abuse reporting pieces, but all advocates are trained in being transparent about any mandatory reporting requirements, so the person knows upfront that there are limits to the confidentiality. But that confidentiality allows someone to develop a frank relationship with someone and share the totality of what's happened to them if they feel comfortable. Also, our advocates are trauma informed, so they recognize that one person's solution is not another person's solution. And really what a person needs right now is to be heard and listened to. So key is having safe places where people can be heard and not having a ton of unintended consequences fall out of those conversations, right? Having these safer spaces.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that was shared. And I think a big part of it is also just being believed. You know, not asking a million questions, walking alongside them of where they're wanting to take you and kind of honoring that space as Emily's kind of sharing. And I 100% agree. I think a victim advocate so that that person doesn't feel alone. So maybe connecting them to the right resources and kind of walking alongside them as much as you can until they have that connection for me would be critical in that environment. And given that circumstance you shared.
And I just want to add too, because we have this great group of people working in education, I believe, on the call, that it's important to protect that and firewall it. So if you have confidential advocates that are employed by the school, there needs to be a way that we can make sure that they're confidential, right? That they're not beholden to the person that's writing their paycheck to report what happened up the chain of command. So this is different than a Title IX coordinator or a responsible employee. And it needs to be clear and transparent to survivors and to the community.
Well, that's all the questions we have now. Thank you so much, Emily and Katrina, for all of your nuggets of information and just so many takeaways from the things you've said for us today. And I'm hoping that folks who participated on this call will take those recommendations and turn them really into actionable steps to address or respond to these types of incidents. So thank you so much for that. As we close, I just want to take the opportunity to turn it back over to the OVW Director, Rosie Hidalgo, who will close us out of this webinar.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I also want to reiterate my gratitude to you, Emily and Katrina, for sharing your insights and experience, and to all of you who've participated with us today. You know, I think as we all know, coaches and trainers can have such a positive role in the lives of student athletes, and we lift that up and we celebrate it. But I think what we've talked about today is that inevitably we have to acknowledge there's a lot of power that coaches and trainers have, and that power can be abused. And it's very similar to other forms of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, that a lot of it is really at the root, power and control that is abused. So thank you for helping us acknowledge that we need to see where that can occur and be so detrimental in the lives of student athletes, and helping us point a way forward to say, what can we do to really prevent and address this? Wishful thinking is not enough. Abstract statements of zero tolerance for abuse is not enough. I think what you all have really laid out for us today are centering the voices and leadership of survivors and of athletes themselves. You've helped us really focus on what it means to have trauma-informed approaches and to recognize that there is no one size fits all. People are impacted in different ways. People need different things. And so how do we create those multiple pathways to safety, to justice, to healing, to well-being? So this is an ongoing dialogue. Thank you for kicking us off today. Thank you so much to Aria Vaughn for the tremendous work that you and your colleagues do at the Education and Opportunities section of the Civil Rights Division in investigating and enforcing these important laws and the ways in which you laid that out for us with this very important case at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And thank you to your other colleagues who were involved in the planning of this webinar for the work they do, Desmond Valverde Daniels and Zara Zalzela. And to our OVW team and Lottie for your leadership and everyone who has supported this, but most of all to all of you who have joined us today for the work you're doing every day. Let's continue to keep in touch, continue to learn from one another, and to prioritize creating college environments where everyone can thrive free from violence and abuse. So thank you and take good care.